It's January 8th, and this huge storm is going to cause some big problems. We have a really large marginal risk of severe weather today, which is going to be for all hazards. So that means a tornado risk, a wind threat, and a hail threat. These are all going to be on the lower side, though. I wouldn't be surprised to see potentially that wind and tornado threat upped in a couple of areas. And then also around that, we have a really large general thunderstorm threat. We could also see some thunderstorms out here in the desert southwest. Now, today is actually the precursor to the main event, which is going to be tomorrow, Friday. I think this is going to be a pretty big system, potentially even a severe weather outbreak, and I would not be surprised to see this upgraded to a enhanced. So definitely be ready for this, and also look out for tomorrow's forecast video. But starting today, our system is pretty much going to start from sunrise, go all the way past sunset. And immediately, it's going to kind of deal with a start along our cold front in parts of West Texas, moving into central Oklahoma, potentially even the OKC metro. And things are really going to start getting going probably about 2 to 3 hours before sunrise. That's when these storms are going to kind of enter a much better environment. First and foremost, the forcing from our jet stream is going to get much better. Our cold front's going to start to sharpen. These are going to enter a much more uncapped, more moist, and slightly more unstable environment. The shear was always there, but now it's going to get even stronger. We're going to potentially start to see these storms rotate, maybe even get embedded supercells right around that time, right when they meet the Red River. And then once they reach the OKC metro, I think there is going to be a chance for maybe even a couple of weeks spin up tornadoes with these, as well as some hail and damaging winds. I think that hail threat's going to be smaller because this is a pretty messy mode. We're not really seeing those discrete cells that we like to see for big hail producers. So I definitely think the main things are going to be a damaging wind threat and potentially even a couple of spin up tornadoes, catching some people by surprise in the morning in the OKC metro. And then after this big blob up here, which is going to be close to our cool front and warm front complex, as well as that low pressure system. That's one of the main reasons, along with our big forcing from our jet stream, why that shear parameters is going to be so good. We're going to see some storms fire off on the south tail of this big complex. Now, these storms are going to have a lot better unimpeded flow into them. These storms up here had some messy stuff in front of them, potentially lowering the cloud basis, which is another reason why I think that tornado threat could be in play. And then the same thing will be in play for lowering those cloud bases with these potentially much more moist environment, much more uncapped, than these shear parameters for these are going to be pretty good. So definitely wouldn't be surprised to see all hazards out of these cells coming out of the south. Doesn't look like they'll sustain super long though, probably by lunch those will be done. And that will be the end of our first round of today's big severe weather. We'll probably start to see things still kind of keep their act together in this main line, maybe a couple of damaging wind threats. I think the tornado threat is probably going to be a bit lower during this time. Definitely wouldn't rule it out, though. I think we still could see a couple of spin ups if we get a couple of kinks in this line, like right here. But overall, this is going to be probably one of the calmer periods of the day. But this will not last for super long. As we go into the afternoon, things are going to start to ramp up once again, and the storms are going to start to enter the best environments yet. And this is also probably the main area where our tornado threat is going to be biggest, just because the ingredients are going to be much, much better. So I think one of the areas which is going to be a main area for tornado concern is this area that I've just circled right here, kind of where Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee meet. I think that's going to be an area which definitely has a solid possibility to produce later. And then also, this is more of the questionable area. We see a ton of blips right here from these cells being initiated from this advection, but currently in this period, there's going to be a pretty strong cap over this area, which means these storms aren't going to get going until the cold front kind of rams into them. Now, that's not entirely a bad thing, though, because that means that these storms would be more discrete, which would give them a better chance to produce all hazards of severe weather. But the question is really, will they get going? Now, the HRRR does have a couple of blips actually mature a little bit around the Little Rock, Arkansas area. definitely think these storms have a non-zero chance to maybe even produce a tornado if they can really get going. But that would be a lot more of a surprise, and this is just a really conditional area right here. I think the main area of concern is going to be right up here, the area that we just talked about previously. And when that low level jet kicks in, we can see right here, we get a nice solid batch of rotating supercells. All these storms right here definitely look like they're going to be rotating and could even be discrete to some degree. So probably when the low level jet kicks off right after sunset, I think that is going to be our peak for potential for tornadoes and just general severe weather altogether in this region right here. Now, we just touched on everything that's more south and probably the more serious stuff, but this line up here more north, probably in more northern and central Illinois, is also going to definitely pose some issues as well. This is going to be mostly a damaging wind threat. As you can see, there's definitely a lot more messy convection in front of this. However, when these crash into the line, there's not a non-zero threat for tornadoes. I think that threat, though, is going to be pretty close to zero, and that's why this area isn't highlighted by the Storm Prediction Center. Definitely the possibility of seeing maybe a couple of blotches with some strong gust in this for sure, because this is going to be essentially a squall at this point, backed up right along that cold front. Just the main thing up here is that we're going to have a really saturated environment, not as unstable, and the moisture is going to start to get worse the farther north we go. But definitely lots of rain with this kind of complex right here with this. Lots of forcing, that low pressure center, that warm front, and definitely some gusty winds and some thunderstorms being possible up here in the greater Midwest. And this guy right here is going to be what's primarily causing a lot of our weather today. We can see our jet stream kind of poking down into the desert southwest. That's why we have that thunderstorm threat there. Then, of course, you can't really miss it. This big guy right here kind of punching into our big area where we're expecting to see some severe weather today. And all of this forcing is going to be a big player in the reason why we're seeing those good shear parameters, a lot more of a linear mode, and then also just generally why we're seeing that threat for severe weather and thunderstorms. And this is just a look from a national scale. Of course, we can see those two areas that we just talked about. Our main weather complex out here in the central to midwestern US, and those thunderstorms back in the desert southwest as well. So that's going to be pretty much it for the rain today across the country. However, with our jet stream dipping down so far, it's going to bring probably a lot of snow in our higher elevations out west. Let's take a quick look at that. And there you go. In the higher elevations, looks like we could see a peak of potentially up to double digits in a lot of places in the country. A couple of these I'm just going to highlight right here, with definitely it maxing out in the Pacific Northwest. Now, actually, we're not going to see that much snow out east and in the Midwest probably until after sunset. Then we might get a little blotch right up here as that low pressure center and kind of whole weather complex moves north into freezing temperatures. Maybe we get a line moving through northern Iowa into northern Wisconsin in the southeastern corner of Minnesota. But now I want to get into the specifics on the environment and really why everything is going to play out why it is. This is starting in the early morning hours for our first round of weather in Texas, and immediately we can see why it's not going to start until sunset. This environment, it just isn't going to be quite primed yet. It's not that moist. It's not that unstable. Definitely some capping going on. We have a big temperature inversion right here. And then also our shear isn't quite there yet. But of course, this is going to change. Here's it just an hour later. We can already see that our instability has ramped up. Our shear parameters have almost doubled in favorability. And then also our cloud base is getting lower. The capping inversion has moved on, definitely a more saturated atmosphere, but also our 3 cape is starting to climb up. And now at this point, severe weather and tornadoes are going to be possible. And probably when these reach OKC or the general OKC metro, this is what it's going to look like. Shear parameters really solid. These storms will have moved through some area cooled by the storms in front of them. I definitely expect our cloud bases to be low enough. Our shear parameters are just going to be off the charts. So even though we have a little bit of a saturated profile near the surface, we have a decent bit of 3 cape, probably enough cape for these storms to get going, definitely below that 1,000 threshold. But with everything else, definitely think this could potentially be the start of when we see all hazards of severe weather kind of starting when these storms reach the OKC metro. And then moving into round 2, when I think we'll see the highest tornado potential, later today in the afternoon to evening hours in that area where Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Illinois kind of meets, even Kentucky. We are going to see just really, really solid shear parameters. The shear is definitely not going to be an issue today at all. Our cloud base is going to be plenty low, and this is a pretty solid thermodynamic profile, even though it's pretty saturated near the surface. Definitely have enough moisture for these storms to get going. Even have some dry air loft, which is going to help to increase that threat for some damaging winds, even though our cape isn't that crazy with all the other ingredients enforcing, and especially a super high 3 cape, almost 183. This is going to be pretty favorable for tornadoes, in my opinion. Maybe even some hail with those more discrete cells, and then also definitely that damaging wind threat. Now, why south of this isn't going to be as favorable is because there's going to be a pretty big capping inversion. We're still going to see pretty much all of these same parameters. They're just not going to be that lifting force yet until later in the day for those storms to kind of get lifted up, get going. And if those storms will even be able to break the cap, we're not quite sure. But in Arkansas, that's why it's kind of iffy on that risk. And up north of that, we're just seeing a super saturated profile. The moisture isn't going to be as good, definitely a bit more capping, and the instability is completely gone at the point. So even though we have some shear, definitely not going to rule out some strong wind gust. It looks like that threat for severe weather is pretty much going to diminish once we get into northern and probably even central Illinois. Wouldn't rule out maybe a couple of severe gusts in central Illinois though. And last but not least, these are our temperatures today, and we're actually going to see some pretty warm temperatures out in the central, southern, and southeastern United States. This is going to be pretty nice weather, I would say, in the low to mid 70s for the feels like range. But of course, that is going to change as that big cold front comes through that's bringing all of our severe weather. That's pretty quick. Even by tomorrow, we can see that it's made a pretty big dent. This was our freezing line before, and this is I won't say freezing line, but definitely our much cooler line, below 50 line is what we'll call it. So definitely that cold front is working, and it's only going to continue to work. So probably by Saturday, this is what we're looking at, and it's only continuing to get cooler and cooler. And we're not really going to see that first giant Arctic blast until probably Sunday, Monday. You can kind of start to see it creeping in up here with some negative feels like temperatures in the far northern US, and everywhere else it's just experiencing some freezing of some sort, feels like temperatures. And that's when we're going to start to see probably a lot of that snowfall come down. And the last thing I want to touch on real quick, I meant to talk about it when I was talking about severe weather earlier and showing you all of the models, but this is just the significant tornado parameter, which pretty much just evaluates how good a storm environment is for producing tornadoes. And we can see this is our first round in the OKC Metro. Definitely some solid values when we're going to see those storms plow through there. That's why I think that chance is also going to be non-zero. And then moving up to what I think is going to be our main risk area as we go into the afternoon, that's when those values really start to catch my attention. So in our main risk area, lots of yellows and orange. This is going to be a fairly favorable environment. And then also in that area that's a little bit more questionable in Arkansas, that could arguably be our best environment for the day. It's just more of a question on if those storms will really get going and break the cap. But if they do, definitely not going to rule out a tornado down there.